we're at the top of the hour and we see people trickling in. So thank you so much for joining us. We're very grateful to see so many people. So really appreciate it. My name is Dorothy Heinrich. I'm technical advisor at the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center. And along with Karen Dahl and Sensida Gigma, we're co-hosting this series about everything you want to know about anticipatory action for drought within the Red Cross Red Crescent. So thank you so much for joining us. We're going to kind of talk through a little bit the goal of the series and then get quickly into the content as well. But maybe I'm going to hand over to a guest of honor. Kara just joined. Kara, you want to say hello and kind of
sure.
Scissors to open the red ribbon.
Thank you, Dorothy. Can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Can you hear me well? Excellent. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Dorothy, Karen, and colleagues for really developing this 8-part series. I'm Kara Siahan. I'm the head of the Anticipation Hub. For those of you who are less familiar with the Anticipation Hub, it is an initiative of the German Red Cross, RCRC, and the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center. Our mission is to facilitate guidance, learning, exchange, and advocacy on all things anticipatory action. We are now powered by 110 partners from the Red Cross Red Crescent movement, NGOs, governments, academia, United Nations organizations, and other network initiatives. So again, I'm really keen to expand the learning. We are happy to host this. Drought, as many of you know, are complex. It's one of the hazards that anticipatory action has been trying to grapple with, develop tools for, and support more national societies to engage in and implement. So we are happy that to see so many of you here today, and we hope the series can be really a way for us to, of course, learn share the knowledge that's already been captured by the colleagues here, but also to hear from your experience and where your needs are. So thanks again for having me, just to say hi to all of you, and best wishes, and have a good series. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dorothy. Over back to you.
Bill will toss to Doug.
And with the red ribbon now cut, it's my pleasure to open the Drought speaker series. Again, welcome those of you who are just joining us. I thought I'd give you maybe a bit of background on the speaker series. So this is what's planned for the next 8 weeks, twice a month. We're talking about drought, hosted on the Anticipation Hub. Everyone's invited. This is going to have a special focus on the Red Cross Red Crescent, but we're very keen to hear about from all people from all different sectors, all different agencies. So please do feel very welcome to share widely. We really want to have as big a crowd as possible thinking about this with us. We're going to share the Zoom links and session descriptions to the rest of the sessions. You can see the agenda there. It's also public on the Anticipation Hub website. And please do reach out to Karen, to Gigma, and to myself if you have any questions, if there's anything specifically you'd like to contribute as well. We're very keen for anyone who wants to jump in with us, so please do. So as Kara explained, the topic of anticipatory action for drought has been growing within the movement. This is something that increasingly we're seeing as a big topic of anticipatory action conversations. And we realized, kind of thinking about this, that we needed a space to kind of talk about what we've learned, what's going right, what's going wrong, what we still haven't quite figured out. And so the goal of this series is really to open the space, to kind of have a space for candid conversations, for informal discussions, for kind of dot connecting, and hopefully for learning from a range of national societies and other partners who have been working very actively on this topic. So this is what we don't want the drought series to be. This is not another meeting that, oh goodness, you have to join. We don't want us to try to solve all the problems in a 45-minute Zoom call. We're going to present some ideas. We're going to kind of talk and hopefully spark some conversations. We're also hoping to not get into much jargon. If we are, please do call us on it. If there are acronyms that we're using, type in the chat, stop using this acronym, I don't understand what it means. Please go ahead. And the other thing we really want this to be is we don't want this to be just a one-off. We made it an 8-part series because we recognize how much there is to talk about. And at the end of the series, the hope is that we'll keep having these discussions. So this is not a one-off. We know that this work is continuing, that it's growing, and that we have more and more questions kind of coming up. So this is really just a space to start these kind of conversations. And here again is what we really want this series to be. We want us to start thinking outside the box. We want us to create a community of practice around these questions. We want people to feel free to voice opinions and ideas. So please make liberal use of the chat, unmute your microphones, interrupt me, please do, and all these things. And so, yeah, so the goal, we know there's actually 55 people on this is quite a lot, but we do want to create this as an informal and constructive space as possible. So before we get started, over to Karen for just a bit of housekeeping before we start with the official program.
Great, thank you very much, Dorothy, for this lovely introduction. So yes, so how will this session look like? So each session will be an hour. So we will have usually in all these 8 sessions, we have an hour of inputs and where we will really zoom into one of the topics. And then we will have a more informal after party for half an hour. So this is the space where first an hour we learn something new, and then in the second half of each session we can really look into, okay, now how do we discuss that between us? And we try to make this as interactive as possible, so really engaging and like throwing ideas at each other. So that is a bit the idea of the second half of each of those sessions. You can use the Zoom chat all the time. Whenever you have questions or something doesn't work for you, let us know. But for general questions for the speakers, we would like to use Slido. And I will post the link here in the chat. So if you have a question, you can just to the speakers that you want to be discussed at the end of each session, please put that into the Slido. And if you like one of the questions of another, there's like next to the question that you will see, there is from another person, you will see a small thumbs up. So that is the possibility for you to say, this is a good question, I want this to be answered. And this will give us a bit of a ranking of the questions so that we can see, okay, this is the question that is really relevant to most of the people. So please use the thumbs up as well if you think, this is a brilliant question, I want this to be answered. And also we will have a collaborative notes document. I will also share the link here. So we will, sorry, I need to just, so we will jointly write notes throughout all of the sessions. For those of you who are familiar with the template of the early action protocols provided by the IFRC, you will recognize the structure of these collaborative notes. So this is basically following the structure of the early action protocol template. And what we want to do throughout this series is to fill this with the different examples and then to basically create our own EAP based on the different sessions. And lastly, if you haven't realized already, there is French translation. So if you want to listen in French, you can click on the small globe at the bottom of the Zoom, and there you can switch the language. So there is live interpretation to French. So if you need that, please click on the little globe. We will also put that in the chat again. I think with this, I'll hand over back to Dorothy.
Thank you so much, Karen. This is brilliant. Please, yes, again, make use of the chat, make use of the Slido, ask us questions. We want to hear, we know that there's a lot of experts in the room here, so that's really the goal of all this. So thank you so much. Should we get started? So, wow, it is 1:09. So wonderful. So the goal of the first session today, so we want to talk about why drought is a humanitarian issue. Why is this something that we as a humanitarian sector is concerned about? What are these impacts, these humanitarian impacts that are caused by drought? What are some assumptions that we might have? What is work currently being done on the topic? And what is the role of the Red Cross Red Crescent in these conversations? So we'll touch a little bit on this in the panel, but that'll especially be the topic of the after party after the formal session is over. So if you're keen, please do join and contribute. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to Irene, who probably doesn't need any introductions, but she's the manager of the Anticipatory Action Team at the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center. And we've asked Irene to kind of just give us a quick overview of what's going on in the movement on anticipatory action for drought. Irene, can I hand over to you?
Sure. Thank you so much, Dorothy, Karen, and team for putting this together. I wonder, should I speak in French or should I stick to English?
Please, in French.
I'll stick to English. That's all I know. So yes, my task is a simple one, I would say, and I have only 5 minutes to deliver on this. And I would be happy to just take us back to a historical watch on where we started from with anticipatory action. Of course, our very first documented institutional anticipatory action and or FPF by then was in 2008 in West Africa for floods where the DREF was activated based on the seasonal forecast. And so the concept has grown over the years, and towards, of course, the late 2010s, we are now seeing the dynamic growth to be able to address all types of hazards, from rapid onset to slow onset. And while we started most of our FBF initiatives around floods and storms, we've recognized that, you know, there is also opportunity to take anticipatory action for slow slow onset hazards as well. And so the conversations around drought have grown, and also interestingly, also exploring to other hazards as well, including epidemics. And so if you can see, look at that timeline. So there have been quite a number of national societies who've been engaged around developing this FPF for different hazards. But among the milestones that we are proud of and that, you know, we keep talking about is also the growth, the birth and the growth of the Anticipation Hub. Kara's already shared her reflections earlier on, but 2019, we celebrated the birth of the Anticipation Hub. And then following up on that shortly, we also had the development of the drought guidance notes that was led by Dorothy and team. And of course, this was because there was a lot of momentum that had come around the conversations. How do we address a drought issue, you know, with all the complexities that it has? And then we're excited in 2021, we had our first drought EAP, the Early Actions Protocol, that was developed by Niger Red Cross, and this was food insecurity linked to drought, where they identified their triggers and mentioned the early actions that they would like to address towards drought. And increasingly, this has grown. Next slide, please. And so when you look at the state of play of anticipatory action protocols generally and specific to drought, so within the Red Cross movement, we have 23 national societies that are engaged on anticipatory action for various hazards, including tropical cyclones, volcanic ash, drought, population movement. And out of that, we have at least 5 early actions plans that have been approved so far for drought. So we have Lesotho, we have Zimbabwe, we have Honduras, Kenya, and Niger. And then we have other 10 that are in the pipeline, all looking at drought. And of course, if you look at the map, the concentration is around West Africa, Northeastern Africa, and Southern Africa. And of course, we're also having a lot of interest that is growing around simplified EAPs, where national societies would like to be able to address the impacts of these hazards that may not necessarily require robust analysis as the full EAP. So all these guidance and tools are available, and it's exciting to see that the interest of national societies around being prepared for various hazards, including drought, is growing. Next slide, please. And so over the years, what have been our lessons? I know most of us have been engaged in drought conversations and planning at various levels, and we have a lot to take home. But I just want to summarize what we have here. Of course, this is not to say this is an exhaustive list, but, you know, kind of, yeah, a little bit of what we are excited to share with the team. And we'd also be excited to hear from you. You can put into the chat what your lesson has been. So if you look at this list, one thing that I have seen that has been common across the various conversations and contexts where we've been having conversations around developing anticipatory early actions plans for drought, both within the movement and beyond the movement. So one challenge that we have is the definition around drought, you know. First and foremost, it's quite a very political conversation in terms of how do you define drought. And so this has also been kind of, we've been running in circles. How are we defining drought? You know, are we dealing with a hydrological drought? Are we dealing with a meteorological drought? Are we dealing with a socioeconomic drought? And all, you know, sometimes without clarity on what name you're tagging to a problem that you'd like to solve, it becomes very, very challenging. Also, interestingly, we've had certain scenarios where actually the people engaged in defining plans for drought say, you know what, it actually doesn't matter what name you're calling it, this is the problem that we want to address. But yes, so that is one big challenge that we face. And then also the timelines in terms of when do you begin taking early action for drought, given that it's a slow onset. Some of these impacts are felt months later. So pinning that point in time in terms of this is the actual time that you should be able to start taking anticipatory actions has been a big challenge that we are grappling with. But also good to know, there's been learnings that has been coming across around some of these challenges. Then also one thing that has been quite very interesting, a learning point for us is the assumption that we have around the causes of the impacts of drought. And the classic example we have is usually Somalia, we tend to attribute every drought-related impact to a shortfall of rain, and yet this isn't necessarily the case. So it is important that we undertake a very, very in-depth analysis of the cause and effects of what a community is facing, for example, so that we are able to make attribution statements. In Niger last year, the EAP for drought was activated, but it was interesting that actually the rainfalls were not really as deficient as would have been expected. And so there is a common tag around, don't always blame the rain. And I think we end up being victims of always pointing fingers to drought. So it is important that we are very clear and we test our assumptions in terms of what are the drivers of the drought related impacts that we are facing. So again, like I said, we all have lots of learnings to share. We all bring a lot of expertise on the table around what we've learned so far from drought, but this is just a sneak peek into some of the learnings that we're excited to share with you. So Dorothy, given that you've only given me a cup of 5, I hope I am still within that, and I hand back the baton to you. Thank you.
I think it was unfair of me, Irene, to ask you to summarize all the learnings from the last couple of years in 5 minutes, but thank you so much for the overview. And I think it gives hopefully a little bit of a flavor of the types of questions that we're grappling with at both kind of conceptual levels, at very practical levels, and across the board, across contexts. So really appreciate it. And please, everyone, tell us, if you want to share learnings that you have as well, use the chat, let us know what are the kind of the key learnings that you have or the key questions. If you want to pop them in the Slido, we'd really love to hear from you. So Irene, thank you again so much. I'd like to suggest that we take a step back right now, and I'm going to hand over the microphone to Daniel Maxwell, who's a professor at Tufts University and research director at the Feinstein International Center for, at the Friedman School of Nutrition at the Feinstein International Center at Tufts University in Boston. We're very lucky to have Daniel join us right now. He's a long-lasting expert on drought, on food security and famine. He's worked a lot in Somalia, in particular on the 2011 drought and situation that happened there. And I know he's going to tell us more about this as well. And he's also a member of the kind of famine review committee for the integrated food security phase classification system, so the IPC. So we're really brilliant to have his expertise and his thought on this, kind of take us a step back. Let's think about why drought is a humanitarian issue that we should be concerned about, and to tell us a little bit as well about some lessons learned from that side. So Dan, could I hand over to you?
Yeah, thanks, Irene. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you perfectly. Thank you.
Okay. Let me just start by running us through an old problem in this business. There are various different ways of shaping how we look at this. I tend to look at the world from kind of an outcomes point of view. I've spent most of my career working on food security crises, famines, etc. In other words, looking at the sort of humanitarian outcome end of the problem and trying to be as eclectic as possible about the drivers of the problem. But here we're focusing on the drivers, and there is a long tradition in my field of dealing with this problem. Almost 30 years ago, Margie Buchanan Smith and Susanna Davies wrote a book that was about the problem of foreseeing a problem or foreseeing a coming crisis and not doing anything about it. The book was published in 1995, but most of the research was from the late 1980s or early 90s. So it's at least 30 years ago. And it's a problem that we still haven't really learned how to resolve or to deal with. And most of their examples, not all of them, but most of their examples were about drought. And we've seen, repeated examples of this in the late 1990s, early 2000s in Ethiopia, the 2005-2006 Mandara Triangle crisis, which was drought, and of course Somalia in 2011 is kind of the worst case scenario. This is a timeline that came from an HPG document on the Mandara Triangle drought, which again, okay, so this is now 10 years after Margie's book. And it was trying to point out in terms of a timeline, the missed opportunity for doing something to prevent the impact of drought rather than simply responding to it after the fact with humanitarian action, etc. So in fact, we knew that there were early warnings of this drought long before October and November. October and November were when the rains actually failed. But there was a window of opportunity to take some kind of preventive action, I guess what we would today call anticipatory action. But because of the sort of cumbersome nature of assessments and funding appeals, et cetera, it was really 6 months later before any major response got up and running. And of course, that completely missed the window of opportunity for any kind of intervention to protect livelihoods, which of course is primarily what we're talking about here. And then if we go on to our sort of worst case scenario in Somalia in 2011, if we can go to the next slide, please, Dorothy. The diagram on the left here is from a rather famous and damning article by Chris Hilbrunner and Grania Maloney on the early warning and the complete lack of response in the run-up to the famine in 2011. So all those little flags there on the left are extraordinary early warning bulletins. They're regular reporting. These are above and beyond the regular reporting. The dark line is the rate at which well, in those days it was called the CAP appeal, it's now called the HRP, the rate at which the funding towards the 2011 Somalia CAP appeal was being addressed. And then the famine declaration, of course, in mid-July, and suddenly overnight, both the funding and the response quickly picking up, but by then it was clearly, obviously too late. The one on the right shows both the baseline and the total mortality. So the difference between those is the number of people who lost their lives as a result of that crisis. And as you can see, even by the time the famine was declared, we were already past the peak of the mortality, and by the time response got to scale, we were well past the peak. So those are kind of the examples of where we're coming from here and why this is still a problem. But let's go on to, I think the next one now is, oh, okay, no, we're still on history here. Press it once more, Dorothy, and there's some lines to bump up. So this is the, in response to that 2011 crisis, donors asked the Food Security and Nutrition Analysis Unit for Somalia to come up with a more active kind of early warning mechanism. So this is their dashboard that combines all these different factors you see down at the bottom and kind of compiles them both by severity and simply by frequency. And so the more of these indicators that are triggered for high severity, the higher this sort of mountain range becomes here. And you can very clearly see the 2016-17 crisis and then the one that we're in currently. So we do have the information systems to let us know about these things, but we're still in trouble on the response. I think the last two slides of this part are simply about the current situation. So you can see we're now, I'm sure everyone knows, I don't need to remind anyone that we're now in between the 5th and 6th season of below average rainfall in the whole Horn of Africa, not just Somalia, and anticipating a below average March, April, May rains in this coming season as well. And you can see this is now looking at outcomes. These are all IPC phase classification maps. So these don't say anything about the drought. They simply depict the humanitarian conditions on the ground. And you can see over the period of time for the last year or so, how the situation has gotten increasingly worse. I think maybe that's the last one of those. Yeah, so let's talk about maybe from the point of view of anticipatory action, what's different about drought. And I should say before I start into this that personally, I have never worked in a flood or storm emergency or an earthquake or any other kind of hazard that's a sort of one and done emergency. All of the places that I've worked have been either in conflict or in drought or some combination of the two. So I'm sort of comparing here to a hypothetical. But the first point is that it's rarely just drought. I think some of these points kind of build on things that Irene has already said. But in none of these cases was drought the only driver or the only shock that was causing the humanitarian emergency. If you looked at the 2010-2011 crisis, there certainly was a very serious drought, two back-to-back poor rainy seasons, one of which was quite catastrophically poor. But there was also a global food price crisis that was not particularly related to the production shock resulting from the drought in Somalia. It was global, and even in the best of years, Somalia imports most of its food grains. But there was also conflict. There was extreme constraints on access. There were counterterrorism restrictions that prevented both early response and simply humanitarian response, etc. And in the 2023 crisis, it's the same story. It's drought, it's food prices that were significantly complicated by or made worse by the war in Ukraine. Came on the end of both the desert locust infestation and COVID, and ironically was included flooding and drought at the same time, and also conflict in terms of this uprising against Al-Shabaab and kind of the counterinsurgency movement that's going with this. Actually, if we could back up to the fourth slide for just a second. Yeah, that one. This compiles all these different factors into a single kind of index. And some of these factors are clearly related to outcomes. So nutrition, population movement, and health are clearly more related to outcomes than they are to drivers. But insecurity, climate, and market factors are more on the driver's side. So you can see here, number one, the multiple causes, and secondly, much of these crises is actually driven by market factors, in addition to insecurity and climate. And part of this is simply a reflection of the way the dashboard is constructed. But in many ways, you can see that market factors are bigger drivers here than climate alone. So, and of course, the two are related, but the two are also somewhat independent. Let's go back to that other slide then. That just made the point about, we've got to consider multiple shocks, even if drought is kind of the headline as it is at the moment. Secondly, all of these things have different time frames, different effects on livelihood systems, and therefore require different kinds of interventions. So drought is the sort of classic slow onset crisis, although to be honest, in some cases drought has hit with amazing speed, even though we think of it as a slow onset crisis. But other things, I mean, certainly things like the impact of the Ukraine crisis on food prices, etc., much more rapid in terms of their onset and may well change what we are trying to do or how we're trying to understand the impact of drought. I would argue that in the past year, probably food prices have been at least as big a driver of humanitarian outcomes in a place like Somalia or other heavily food import dependent countries, as has been the drought. And then finally, there are things that we need to take into consideration, but don't necessarily translate into a covert shock. So in many cases, in many parts of southern Somalia, for example, the issue of conflict isn't necessarily one where there is a sudden shock or impact. There are sometimes, but in many cases, it's simply lack of access to markets, constraints on movement, other things that really affect people's livelihood, but are difficult to trace to a particular point in time. So if we're thinking about responding to drought, we've got to take these other things into consideration as well. And then we come to this business about early warning. And we often think that we get the early warning right, and it's the response, the early action, the anticipatory action, where we're still not getting things right. That was certainly the storyline from the book that Margie and Susanna wrote 30 years ago. and it's still to some degree largely the case. But there are difficulties associated with drought that may be more, and again, there are probably people in the room who can speak to this issue better than I can, but with a shock like flooding, I think that the spatial and temporal specificity of the impact of flooding is easier to predict than the spatial and temporal specificity of something like drought. So, for example, we knew that this past season was going to be bad in Somalia, but we didn't know in advance that it was going to be relatively less bad, for example, in Bakol and in Lower Shabelle than it was going to be in Bai. And had we had that kind of information, it might have changed the way that we thought about anticipatory action based on both livelihoods, but also where we thought that the rainfall was going to be the worst or the best, et cetera. But we don't really have that kind of spatial and temporal specificity, at least yet. There's also, of course, well-known challenges to seasonal forecasting, especially the March, April, May rains in the Horn of Africa, and indeed in 2022, there were two kind of competing seasonal forecasts, and that unfortunately confused the donors and some of the decision makers and led to delays or simply inaction. And finally, we've always got to deal with the question of probabilistic forecasts. Unfortunately, we have kind of developed this habit of developing a single most likely scenario in our early warning and putting that out there as the basis for decision making. But we all know that early warning is not a slam dunk, and so some of us have been promoting more the idea of at least three scenarios. You know, a most likely scenario, a best case scenario, and a worst case scenario, and thinking about planning on the basis of all of those and trying to figure out how we can monitor the assumptions behind each one of those scenarios as the season progresses, and change programmatic interventions accordingly. That, of course, wishes for a good deal more flexibility than there often is in systems. But I hope that's the direction that we're going, because we've had some difficulties by relying on a single kind of scenario. The fourth issue I just want to mention briefly is around triggers, which have become an important component in the link between early warning and anticipatory action. But triggers have to reflect both the forecast and the changing drivers, and they have to fit the livelihoods calendar of whatever the affected population. Sorry, is there a question? Have to fit the livelihoods calendar, and not just a sort of a humanitarian program calendar. I mean, Aaron and I are looking at some results of anticipatory action in Somalia and Ethiopia now, and you know, just due to things like the humanitarian program cycle or like the speed of response, etc., we're finding unfortunate things like, you know, seeds, drought-resistant seeds, but showing up at the end of the rainy season rather than the beginning of the rainy season, etc. So, still got some improvements to make there. Then, in terms of the actual actions, obviously, we have to fit these things to livelihood systems, and we have to think about the duration of the crisis. I mean, what's really different about drought from especially storm or flooding related crises is the duration of the crisis. It's not a kind of a one and done shock, which, if you can enable people to somehow weather that initial shock, you can sort of come out on the other side of the shock and help people get back to some kind of normalcy or post disaster recovery. Now, to be fair, no one foresaw that we were going to have 5 failed seasons in a row in the Horn of Africa, but that's what we've ended up with. So in many ways, the kinds of actions that we take have to consider the possibility of much longer term impacts. And then, you know, trying to adapt those things to the livelihood system. So, you know, back to the Mandera Triangle crisis, for example, that was primarily in a pastoral area. So, you know, the kinds of anticipatory actions that we would have liked to have seen be taken would have been things like commercial livestock offtake, or, you know, protection of core breeding stock, animal health, etc., and probably cash support. Although in those days we were kind of in the pre-cash era. We knew about cash because it was after the tsunami, but cash was not widely used in Somalia for either response or anticipatory action until after the 2011 crisis. But this kind of brings up a final question that maybe is a little bit academic, but maybe is something for us all to think about, and that is, what's the difference between anticipatory action and simply early response, or even post-shock response? We did a little study on this for FAO in the Horn of Africa a couple of years ago, and one of the questions that arose was, well, okay, if you're facing a drought in Somalia, what would be the anticipatory action? And of course, it would be livestock interventions, it would be drought-resistant seeds, and it would be cash transfers. But if you're facing an acute humanitarian emergency in Somalia, what would the response be? And it might be the same things. So what exactly is the difference between what's anticipatory and what's responsive? And does it matter? Do we need to be doing different things at different times? And then finally, one of the things that I've been kind of frustrated with over the past year or so, since we had this kind of conflicting seasonal forecast for the March, April, May rains in 2022, was still trying to get people to think in an anticipatory way and plan in an anticipatory way, plan for interventions in an anticipatory way. But many people were saying, oh no, it's too late for anticipatory action in Somalia now. It's all about, you know, scaling up. And even you know, into the summer and the fall, when again we were predicting below average rainfalls, it was all about scaling up. You know, all hands on deck. We've got to respond to the here and now, and to get people to think in an anticipatory way about what's likely to happen, you know, next month or 3 months from now or 6 months from now, and what can be done now to prevent that situation being worse, I think remains a challenge to us. And I guess this is probably not just in drought emergencies, although the longer time frame we have for these crises, the more this becomes a significant issue. So I don't know, Dorothy, those are just a few thoughts for me to throw out, maybe for a discussion starter. I don't necessarily claim to have the answers to any of these things, but I think there are lots of things that we could have a conversation about. So back to you, Dorothy.
Thank you so much, Dan. Really appreciate it. I don't know you, but my brain is buzzing. I think you brought up so many points that I think we saw from Irene's intervention as well. And I think this question of kind of temporal spatial specificity of like, when does drought actually start? Does it even matter? And really, I think this last point that you're thinking about is thinking beyond project, thinking beyond timelines, thinking beyond humanitarian calendars and those sorts of things, and really thinking at like a system level is how is that impacting the way that we think about anticipatory action for drought. I think it's really fantastic. And I hope that you stick around for the panel discussion. There's going to be, I think we're kind of throwing a lot of ideas at you. And right now, the idea is really just to start thinking about all these different dynamics. So if you see anything that kind of resonated, especially with the work that you're doing, please do let us know. And Dan, thank you so much for talking us through that. I took a lot of notes. Really appreciate it. Everyone, we have about 20 minutes left for a kind of panel discussion. We have some brilliant people who are here right now to join us. So I don't know, Karen, if you can pin everyone, and I'll name them and maybe you can pin them at once. And the goal for the panel discussion is we have a couple leading questions to help, but if you can contribute to the questions that were asked through the Slido, kind of encourage our panelists to just talk to each other and maybe reflect on what Daniel just presented and what Irene said as well. That would be really fantastic. So here we go. Here's our list of speakers for the panel. We have Emma Mwangi, who's a doctoral researcher at Sussex University in the UK. She was part of the team at Kenya Red Cross who developed the first kind of Kenyan flood and drought early action protocols, and has a lot of experience in thinking of these topics, both from the academic side and very much from the humanitarian practice side as well. She's joined by Colleen Zamazaba, who's the FBF project coordinator at Eswatini Red Cross, who are currently working on their drought early action protocol. Actually, Emma and I were in the conversation with the RCS just this morning. So thank you for joining us, Colleen. We also have, probably does not need much introduction, we have Erin Coughlin here, de Perez as well here, who's a research director and prof at the Friedman School of Nutrition at Tufts, and also obviously a senior advisor at the Climate Center. And we're joined by Alejandra Turan, who's an international delegate currently working for German Red Cross in Honduras and Guatemala, currently thinking a lot about this question of anticipatory action for drought and how it applies. And here he is as well. So thank you so much to the four of you for joining us. So loads of questions, but I think maybe the first question, Kali, I might hand over to you. I'm curious, in your experience with working with Eswatini Red Cross and thinking a lot about these questions, what are the main impacts of drought that currently Eswatini Red Cross is concerned about, and what do you think should be these impacts that we're focusing on as the humanitarian sector? You might need to unmute your microphone. Yeah, there we go.
Thank you, Dorothy, for having us here in the learning series. And thank you for the introductions that you have just made, and it's a great privilege for us to be part of the panel. To just respond to your question on the main impacts of drought in the country, usually we see a lot of failure, which usually result in the reduction of crop yield. And that was pronounced in the last drought that we had in 2015-2016. Then the second one, which is also a problem in the country, is the death of livestock. We have seen more than 80,000 deaths in the country due to the previous drought in 2015-2016. And Eswatini being a small country, I think, and I believe that was a huge loss if you look it or if you compare it against the GDP of the country. And you must remember that most of the people in the rural areas depend on livestock for their livelihood, as well as growing of crops for their livelihood. And this kind of farming is actually rain-fed, and it is more like a subsistence kind of an activity. Then the next one is water shortages. We have seen a lot of water shortages in the country, especially I always like to make an example of the previous drought episode that took place in 2015-2016. So a lot of people were unable to access clean water for different activities in the country. So we saw a lot of water tracking that took place in the country, even in the areas that we know they usually receive good rains during the summer period. Then the last one is, of course, a kind of a secondary impact, which is hunger or maybe malnutrition, especially in young children. Dorothy, I think that is what I can say for now, unless there will be some more follow-up questions.
Thank you so much, Kali. No, and I think it's brilliant. You're currently kind of so much thinking about this, and I think it's helpful for everyone also to hear a little bit about what Eswatini Red Cross is doing. So everyone, highly encourage that you reach out to Kali if you're curious, but there's going to be work coming out as well. So just watch this space. And I think there's a lot of interesting collaborations as well that Eswatini Red Cross is doing currently with the NDMA and the Eswatini Met. And so there's a lot of lessons, I think, that's coming from that, which we'll hopefully be able to touch on in the next sessions as well. So Kali, thank you so much for joining us. I'm curious, Alejandro, let's jump to the other side of the world. And I know that there's been a lot of work in Latin America and the Caribbean thinking about anticipatory action for drought. There's an early action protocol in Honduras that's been approved, and a bunch of other national societies that are currently working on this question. And given this experience, I'm curious what you think is going well. What do you think we're getting right? What do you think we're not getting right? And what do you like? What still questions do you still have on this topic that might be coming from the region?
Okay, thank you, everyone. Well, I think that the things goes well is to find triggers jointly with meteorological services, not just in Honduras. Remember that we have this dry corridor that covers 4 countries in Central America. It's very important for us to tackle this event in a proper manner. So we find triggers with our scientific advisor from the Climate Center was very important for us. I think that the joint efforts with FAO and WFP, it would be good too, because we are trying to tackle this event, as the doctor said before, with regional approach and the participatory manner. Yeah, it's kind of challenging to try to fit the livelihood calendar in all these efforts with the early action plans here in Central America. But we have a lot of information about droughts, but probably in the events of this extreme events of 1982, 1997, and 2014, there's not a lot of evidence of humanitarian impact. So it's trying to collect this information in the field, with interviews with the people, with the governments. So I think the information flows very well, but there is some information that we have some gaps about humanitarian impact. So yeah, I think it's the most important that I underline here. Over.
Thank you so much, Alejandro. And I think that that's great. It's interesting to hear about this kind of question of system building and all the work that you're doing as well. Like by bringing this kind of a more integrated approach, this is not, maybe reflecting back on what Daniel said as well, this is not just a one-off project, right? You're seeing this as kind of a bigger systematic shift. And I think that's really interesting to hear about as well. And we hear you on the data gaps and limitations. I think that's probably a big problem for most people. So maybe a call for people who are recording humanitarian impact data, please do more. And I agree. I think interesting to hear also just finally about the challenges you've come across in terms of talking about things. I know there's been a lot of discussion in the region about how do you actually define drought? What does it mean to look at, especially with multiple lenses for multiple countries that you're looking at? I think there's a lot maybe there to unpack, so I hope that these conversations can continue as well. It's interesting to hear across regions too, that there are some things that are very similar and that there are some things that are quite different. It'd be fun to put you and Colleen in a room and kind of debate what you've both found. Thank you so much. I'm going to pass over now to Emma. I'm curious, because you've been thinking about this both from a practitioner side and from an academic side now, I'm curious what you think are the big questions that we're still grappling with, the things that we really haven't figured out, like where are our blind spots? Maybe this is part of the research that you're doing right now. It's certainly part of the work I know that you're doing with the Climate Center and beyond. So tell us, what are we missing? What's the big question?
That's an interesting question, Dorothy, because I still think in terms of drought being a slow onset disaster, we are just scratching the surface as a movement and as practitioners, because just going back to the earlier conversations, if I would go sequentially with how maybe the EAP is ordered, and just even think about what different actors are doing. Are we even synchronizing the methodologies that we are using? Are we synchronizing be it the indicators, or are we as actors in this space just duplicating whatever each and everyone is doing? Where is all the coordination? Who's bringing all the efforts? Or are we approaching, for example, the Met Service differently and saying, oh, I would like to develop a trigger for this particular area, whereas the other person is developing a trigger for another area, and that becomes quite confusing in it, or everyone is creating their own technical working group. So for me, coordination is still quite a big problem in this space. Then moving on to the risk analysis, and what has been on my mind often is that if I look back at, for example, the work we did in Kenya Red Cross and thinking about people's vulnerabilities and all that, with time that has changed, and how are we thinking about evolving vulnerability, for example? If you go back to maybe the people we thought were vulnerable in 2019, how has that space changed with all the multi-hazards that we're seeing? We've seen COVID, we've seen floods, and all those things coming into this space. And even what we thought then was like a drought event in Kenya, that you have maybe 2 failed seasons, then you recover in the third or something, that has also changed. So what does it really mean for us? Are we even understanding, or have we even conceptualized this in a changing climate? And don't even move to the data aspect, because when you're thinking about vulnerability again, and you're looking for data on all these indicators, and even thinking which indicators are you going to use to define vulnerability, that becomes a completely different space. And I know the societies that are creating MOUs with information providers and all that, but are we thinking about the sustainability of it post the project that's doing the EAP, or post, mostly the projects that write up the EAPs? Then moving on then to the trigger, I think one of the things that I've seen, it's like the whole anticipatory work has sort of been a wake-up call for the meteorological service and for all early warning information providers. I mean, they're like, oh, wait, what you're asking us to produce, you're asking about IBF. It's no longer me telling you that tomorrow it's going to rain or it's not going to rain. You're now asking me, oh, what will that mean for me? And that has been a wake-up call, capacity-wise, infrastructure-wise, and I think that's still a struggle. And I'm hoping that that's a conversation that's carried further up. The societies at the national level can handle it, but are we bringing it to a bigger space? Are we bringing it to, for example, the World Meteorological Organization, that we are shifting? How do we enable people to work? And then there are situations where there are existing early warning systems, and we're like, oh, wait, there is something existing here, we can ride on it. But then you start thinking about it and you're like, do these indicators really work? If we interrogate them, are these the indicators I should really be using, considering they were conceptualized so many years ago? So it's a whole new thing. And then lastly, to tie it all up, it's about the funding. If we look at the scale of drought events, for example, look at Kenya with 80% of the country being arid and semi-arid. If we think about then the funding that goes into anticipatory action, is that enough for all those people? And what are we doing about it? Are we advocating for more funding? Is it going to come from government? Is it going to come from development actors? I don't know. And moving forward with a changing climate, it means we need more money. Or is it that then we tie that up and we have layered financing as well? The way we are thinking about layered anticipatory action, is it that we have layered instruments that tackle this along the way, that initially this is what we'll use, then as we see the cascading impacts, and we have other funding streams coming into play. So a lot of things still pending, Dorothy, and I hope that this conversation starts tackling a few of those. Back to you.
Emma, thank you so much for that thoughtful answer. I really appreciate our brainstorms, and it's just nice to bring this to a wider group, so thank you. And I think you bring up so many valid points that we've been talking about as well very recently. And this question of finance, and maybe a challenge to all of us to figure out, is the scale, right? We saw from Daniel's presentation, from what Irene showed us, wow, the scale is massive, right? When we're thinking of these huge droughts, what exactly is anticipatory action supporting? and what's the scale up actually look like? What does that mean? I think that's to end on reflection on your last point. I think that's a really important one, and something that I think we have to be very humble about asking ourselves as well. So thank you. Erin, you're last on my list. I wanted to kind of get you as well, your take on, and stepping back a little bit and thinking again about this kind of bigger system building, how we're thinking about anticipatory action for drought, and maybe its links to resilience as well. And I'm curious, I know you've been doing a lot of work on the Somalia stuff right now, but I know you've worked much more on the concepts of anticipatory action and how it contributes to longer term resilience and adaptation. And I'm curious, from what you've been seeing and what you've been seeing from this conversation and beyond, what do you think is the role of anticipatory action in building long-term adaptation, either to climate change or to changing demographics? What is the space that anticipatory action is filling in these kind of longer-term discussions?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think anticipatory action is one of the tools in our toolbox to manage a world with more extreme, right? So if we have more droughts or more floods or more heat waves, being able to look at the weather forecast or the climate forecast and take action is one of our tools in our toolbox. So I think it can be very valuable, especially in a place with a changing climate. Have our anticipatory action efforts contributed to longer-term climate change adaptation efforts? I think not. I think, we've certainly been pushing for cash, and cash seems to really benefit people during extreme events, but at least small amounts of cash don't seem to meaningfully change people's outcomes in the longer term, right? It might help them get through the shock, but it's not encouraging transformation. There have been some efforts, I think, by WFP to do cash for work to build assets, community assets that would then be useful for future droughts. So I think that there are some people experimenting in this area, but we don't yet know if those worked and if that was a good idea. So let's see, we'll find out. We can ask them in a little while and try to follow up. So I think that can be, so yes, I think anticipatory action can be a tool in our toolbox. Droughts are also very affected by temperatures. High temperatures evaporate water, and so I think it's something we can talk about, especially in the context of climate change. However, I agree with everyone who has said that rainfall is probably not important. I mean, I think you should probably depart from the assumption that local rainfall is not important. And then if you find out that it is, and it is somewhat related to food security in a particular location, then maybe you could pursue drought. But I would not start from the assumption that drought causes certain outcomes unless you can really show that link. And most of the time, I think that assumption is actually false. Like food prices locally are usually not affected by drought locally. Food prices locally are usually affected by global events. That's just how our economies are built these days. And we have a PhD student looking at this at Tufts, showing that local grain prices are not affected by local drought. Local grain prices are affected by everything that's happening globally. And so local purchasing power might be affected by local droughts, maybe. But again, you'd have to prove it. I think I would be very, very careful at departing from assumptions when it comes to drought. That would be my feeling.
There's a really nice note to end us on. Thank you, Erin. And I would love to see if anyone's keen to work on this more with us. We're thinking about it at the Climate Center as well. And how do we kind of talk about this a little bit more candidly and openly in I think a lot of these conversations that we're having. So thank you, Erin, for sharing. I think that sounds fantastic. I was told, so I know we've seen time go by, but I was told that everyone has this in their calendar for an hour and a half because there's an after party. And there are some really interesting questions in the Slido. So does everyone mind kind of sticking around for a couple more minutes in the formal session? And I'll ask one or two of the burning questions in the Slido, and then we'll go to kind of the after party. Does that sound all right to everyone? Great, thank you. It was given permission to extend.
Dan, if you can,
yes,
because I think some of the questions are for you.
It's true, actually. Please do join us, Dan, if you're
I can stay for a little bit, but unfortunately I have a doctor's appointment. I can stay for maybe another 10 or 15 minutes, but after that I have to run. So
amazing. Thank you so much. All right, well, then a question for Dan then. Given Daniel's presentation and the evidence that drought very often coincides with other risks, is drought anticipatory action relevant if it addresses only drought, which I'm guessing here addressing only like below average rainfall? So a bit of a start question, is it still relevant if all we're addressing is below average rainfall?
well, it's certainly still relevant. I guess the question is it sufficient? And there the question may be, well, I'm sure the answer is context specific, but I wouldn't say that we should not be responding to drought. If there is an anticipated poor season forecast in a agro-pastoral area, I would never go on record as saying it doesn't make sense to try and get drought-resistant seeds into the hands of farmers before that season. But make sure that if you're going to do that, you get those seeds into the hands of farmers before the season starts, rather than sort of towards the end of the season. And I see Aaron nodding, knowingly, like looking at some of the things we've been looking at recently. So I mean, I think the point isn't to say, oh well, it's not drought. It can still well be drought, but it's not just drought. And again, that's the sort of modal experience in the Horn of Africa. It's not necessarily the case everywhere. So I do think there's a good deal of context specificity here. But I guess I would urge a kind of an overall analysis rather than focusing on a specific driver, even if the anticipatory action itself has to be related to a driver. Just make sure that you're looking at all of them and looking at what makes sense across the boards. Do you want to add to that, Aaron? I don't know.
No, I agree. And Anita, to your point, if it is a food insecurity crisis that you're worried about, then it's good to name that. Say, okay, we're worried about food insecurity. Here are all the things that contribute, and here's what we're going to do because we see this mix of contributing factors. Here's the right choice in this case.
And of course, I better reiterate again that none of these things are just food security crises either. They may be crises of access to water. They may be crises in which access to services like nutrition or public health break down, et cetera, et cetera. So I have colleagues who would kill me if I pretended that something like what's going on in Somalia right now is just a food security crisis. So it's both, multiple hazards and multiple outcomes, which doesn't make planning or intervening any less complicated. It makes it more complicated. But
I'm curious, Cully and Alejandro, if you have any kind of response to that. You're looking at it from a very the practice side of like really how do we apply this? Is this ringing any bells? Is this resonating with your experience? And what do you think? Sorry, throwing this to both of you at the same time. Maybe Alejandro, do you have any thoughts? Although he might be frozen. Cully, any response to that? What do you think?
Dorothy, sorry, is that directed to me? Can you say it again? I missed it out a bit.
So yeah, so we're talking about the complexities of drought and like how do we tackle which drivers of the impacts that we're seeing. So for example, if it's below average rainfall, what actions are we taking and that sort of thing. And I think Daniel just brought up the point that often, droughts have a whole range of impacts that are not, for example, just food security, they're access to water, they're all these things. And I wonder in Eswatini in particular, how you're tackling these different impacts with different actions. If that makes sense.
Okay, I think Eswatini is a bit behind in terms of, you talk about anticipatory action. What we have been dealing with a lot is the response actions. And you will find that it's not as complicated as in other countries. We rarely have conflicts in the country, and you wouldn't in the past we were not expecting such a complex context whereby we have food crisis this side, and on the side we've got conflicts, and you talk about water shortages and all those things. I think it is not that much pronounced especially in Southern Africa. Yeah, maybe that is how I can put it.
I think that's really interesting. Erin, I can see you nodding. Do you have any thoughts on that?
No, and I'm happy to leave it there. I just think that there was a good question in the chat too that I was also nodding about the three scenarios. And so I don't know if anyone would want to comment on that, if people have done this, or maybe Dan wants to comment on it.
Well, the most obvious example in this case is the Greater Horn of Africa Climate Outlook Forums, which present basically the likelihood of an average season, an above average season, meaning better than average rainfall, or a below average season. And they map that by different colors, and the colors refer to different distributions of those possibilities. So, if you go back and look at the map from a year ago, it was projecting a higher likelihood for an average season, but there was still a 25 or 30% chance of a below average season. And I think that's what everyone overlooked, was to what extent it was likely that we were going to have a below average season. So, that's one example. That's related to a specific hazard. Obviously, you could also do it related to outcomes. We tend to look at these IPC maps, for example, as being kind of the especially the projections maps, or what analysts are projecting to happen in terms of food security and nutrition outcomes 3 or 4 months in the future, as kind of received wisdom. But of course, what that is people's best estimate of the most likely scenario, and we don't necessarily see what the worst case scenario or best case scenario is, and that's not to imply that the most likely scenario is some kind of average between those two. The most likely scenario may actually be the worst case scenario, but we rarely see those. And the pushback is that makes decision making more complicated. It makes if decision makers have to think, well, what are the chances of this versus the chances of that? It's easier just to have one thing and focus on that. But that one thing is often doesn't turn out to be correct, and it's I think we just have a difficult time dealing with probabilistic information anyway, and the more honest we can be about what the probabilities are, probably the better it is, even though it doesn't make decision making a sort of a easy, if this then this kind of equation. It's like, if this and this, then what if it does make the decision making more complicated, but I think it makes it more flexible and more accurate and more truthful. I don't know.
Maybe a challenge to us to start thinking about scenarios specifically. I think that sounds like a nice exercise. Maybe some of us should do.
Well, and in other work that we've done on sort of information systems, we're always, particularly in the early warning community, we're always talking about how to improve early warning, how to make the communications better, etc. But one thing that we're often not very good at, and actually maybe the Red Cross movement would be a good place to start since it's a little bit more integrated, is to ask decision makers, whether they're program folks, whether they're government leaders, are they donors, etc., and especially affected communities, what kind of information is the most helpful to you to deal with anticipated hazards, anticipated shocks, and kind of work backwards from that, rather than our usual approach is to hone in on forecasts, on predictions, but maybe producing information that is not helpful to decision makers and to the whole array of decision makers, right the way from donors and governments to people planning anticipatory action, people planning responsive action, to affected communities themselves. So in many ways, kind of working backwards from the needs of users, rather than starting with our own ideas about what are the most important things to forecast.
I can see Emma nodding as you say that. And I think that's great. I think there's a lot of work to happen in that space. In particular, and I think it's nice to hear you say that maybe the Red Cross is one good place for this, acting as boundary organizations, and with a lot of the work that a lot of the FBF programs tend to have to broker conversations between the users of climate service information and the producers, so like a National Met Service and things. So maybe there's an opportunity there to kind of push the conversations beyond just developing early action protocols. I think Alejandro mentioned as well. Everyone, I know we're like very off time. It's 2:10 on my clock, so maybe I'll suggest that we pause it here. I'll kind of hand over to Karen to tell us just a little bit kind of wet your whistle for the next session. And then everyone who wants to stay and like keep having these discussions off recording, kind of just informally, we'd love to have you stay and kind of just start the conversation in an after party with hopefully a hot drink or something. So does that sound all right? Shall we do that? And there's a lot of interesting questions in the chat. Daniel, I know you have to go, but thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it and hope to see you again here very soon. I'll share my screen again just quickly and just to, here you go. Here's an invitation to join us in 2 weeks. Karen?
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, I think this was the perfect start for the next session, because the next session, what we're going to look into is basically exactly that, conceptualizing drought. How has it been done in the EAPs that we have seen so far? So Ethiopia Red Cross will share how they conceptualize drought, how like what is a drought in their context? How did they conceptualize this in Ethiopia, in their EAP? And also we will hear from the University of Lesotho. So they conducted a study together with Lesotho Red Cross on exactly that. How like what are impacts of drought? How can we conceptualize drought in the Lesotho context? So yeah, we will hear how they did it, like what is the result, but also how they did it, how they went through the process, what were the methodologies they used, whom did they involve. And yeah, by answering those questions, also answering like who and what is mostly affected by the drought, and what are the impacts that we are trying to address with our drought EAP. And yeah, is it maybe, yeah, I mean, is it livelihood? So we will see. I mean, we will see that in the next session, and how also did they deal with those drought-like notions when we're talking about dry spells and food insecurity. So basically touching on all these things that we already started touching today. And yeah, we will hear 2 examples of that in 2 weeks. I will paste the link to the registration here in the chat again. And yeah, really looking forward to this discussion in 2 weeks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen. And on that note, everyone, if you need to jump to another meeting, please do. If not, please stay. We can stop the recording.